Our second macronutrient are lipids, and our dietary source of lipids most abundantly are triglycerides. And we learned in A&P Part 1 that a triglyceride is a molecule of what's called glycerol, and glycerol bonds with three fatty acids. So you have three fatty acids, bound to a molecule called glycerol. And these triglycerides come in three forms in our diet: saturated, unsaturated, or trans fats. Saturated means we have a chain of carbons that are saturated with hydrogens, meaning that all the carbons are bound to each other with single bonds. And they can stack together very nicely and neatly and become very compact molecules. Therefore, they're saturated with hydrogens. They come from meats, dairy foods, so mostly animal products, although there's an exception with coconut. So these saturated fats at room temperature are solid. So S saturated, S solid. Where unsaturated fats, carbon is bound to carbon, but some carbons are double bonded to other carbons. So when you have a double bond between carbon atoms, that means we need less hydrogens to form the molecule, because the double bond will take the place of the hydrogen. So now we're not saturated with hydrogens anymore, so we call these unsaturated fats, which are less dense and are found mostly in our vegetable or plant, I should say, lipids, seeds, nuts, olive oil, vegetable oils. These are plant-based, and at room temperature, these lipids of triglycerides are oils and not solids. And these unsaturated fats are the desirable fats that our body would like to take in because they are healthy for our heart, whereas saturated fats are unhealthy for our cardiovascular system, or heart unfriendly, I guess we can say. Now, trans fats is when they take unsaturated fats and purposely hydrogenate them, so adding hydrogens to them. So they're forcing unsaturated fats to become saturated. So these oils, which were oils originally, they're making them into solids at room temperature, like margarine or shortenings. These are the most unhealthy type of triglycerides, even more than natural saturated fats. So if you see hydrogenated on a label, those are the ones that you should stay away from because they contain the trans fats. Of course, saturated fats aren't the best for your heart either, where unsaturated fats are so. Another source of lipid is cholesterol, of course found in these areas here: egg yolks, meats, organ meats like liver, shellfish, some milk products. However, cholesterol is not necessary for us to take in. It's important in our body. We learned in Chapter 3, I believe, yes, Chapter 3, in our plasma membrane, we need cholesterol to stabilize the plasma membrane to make it stronger. However, our liver makes most of our cholesterol. Therefore, it's not necessary that we intake it. So two of our fatty acids we cannot synthesize in our body. Therefore, they're essential fatty acids which we must take in. Linoleic and linolenic sound very similar, but those are the two essential fatty acids that we must ingest. The linoleic is an omega-6, the linolenic is an omega-3. They're found mostly in vegetable oils, so their intake is typically not a problem because we get plenty of that in just a normal diet. And here is why we need lipids, because adipose tissue offers us protection. Think about landing on your butt if you fall versus your elbow. One hurts way more than the other, right, because of its protective nature. Insulation, whereas it helps hold the heat in our body. It's tremendous fuel storage. Remember how many calories are in a gram of lipid. We've learned in the past that phospholipids, our cell membranes, of course, require lipids. The myelin sheaths around our neurons require phospholipids as well. What I mentioned on the last slide, of course, cholesterol stabilizes our cell membranes. We need cholesterol to produce our bile salts for digestion. Steroid hormones, which we learned in the endocrine system chapter, some of them are amino acid based, but some of them are lipid based, or steroid hormones, which is another use of lipid. Some lipids become prostaglandins, which are needed to contract our smooth muscle in our organs, to control our blood pressure. Triglycerides are the major fuel for our liver cells, which we call hepatocytes, and our skeletal muscles, and help absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So there's some vitamins that we need to intake, and we're not able to absorb these vitamins unless we absorb lipids at the same time. So taking in these vitamins without a fat would be useless because it just pass right through our digestive system. Here we see that fats represent less, or at least should represent less of our dietary requirement, 20 to 35%. And of course, of that 20 to 35%, it should be overwhelmingly unsaturated fats. Saturated fats, hopefully, limited to less than 10%. We mentioned earlier that cholesterol is not required because our liver is able to produce it, so intake should be low as possible, and especially those with high total blood cholesterol levels, because high cholesterol intake is typically associated with cardiovascular disease. Back to table 24.1, but this time we're looking at the lipid portion of it. There are the sources of lipids. Of course, lipids come from animal and from plants, and we went through which would be saturated versus unsaturated. Of our lipids, we have essential fatty acids, the linoleic and linolenic, omega-6 and omega-3, and cholesterol. There's the recommended daily allowance, which I wouldn't be too concerned with except for that number, the 25 to 30%. If we take in too much of these lipids, well, you can likely guess what might happen. Of course, obesity, higher risk of cardiovascular disease, right, seems to be the trend throughout this column. And deficits would be the opposite: weight loss, poor growth, depression even, risk of stroke, which is kind of opposite of what we might think. That's typically not a problem because we don't ever tend to be deficient in cholesterol. Typically it's the other way around. Our third macronutrient is proteins. And we get proteins from, well, I'm going to back up and say we get complete proteins from animal products: eggs, fish, milk, and most of our meats. However, soybeans are considered a complete protein as well. And what we mean by a complete protein, because a certain number of our 20 amino acids are essential, and therefore we must take them in because we can't produce them. So protein sources that contain all the needed essential amino acids are called complete proteins, which we get from animal products, and of course our exception here, soybeans. We have incomplete proteins, so legumes, which are beans and peas, nuts, cereals, cereals contain incomplete proteins, which means they contain amino acids, which are important, but they're going to lack some of the essential amino acids. So legumes will lack some essential amino acids, so will cereal grains, but if they're taken together, which they should, especially if you're vegetarian, they'll contain all the essential amino acids if you combine them together. And we can see that on the next slide here. For example, here is of the 20 amino acids, these are the essential amino acids. And you can count them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 of them, right, all together. So if we just look at our grains, like corn and other grains. In yellow here and in this green are the essential amino acids it contains. So if you just have a grain diet, you're missing 2 amino acids. And on the other hand, if your meals are mostly legumes, well then you're only getting these 6 essential amino acids, and you're missing these ones over here. So taking the 2 together, the grains plus the legumes, you'll cover your bases as far as essential amino acids go. And we see how important proteins are in the body. Look at its uses, structure, and function, right? Anatomy and physiology. So the structural materials in your body, what makes up your structure? Keratin, that's the protein in your skin. Collagen in many of our tissues for strength. Elastin, which allows for stretch and recoil. Muscle proteins add to our structure as well. You might recall myofibrils, right? And myofilaments. Those are all structural proteins. But then we have proteins that actually do work. They're called functional proteins. We know them as enzymes. And some hormones that are not lipid hormones but are amino acid based also have functions or do work in the body. And proteins, like we've learned in the past, are made up of amino acids. Now, amino acids can be synthesized into proteins, of course, on ribosomes, but they can also be burned as fuel. So how does the body decide which amino acids are we going to use to build proteins, or should we use these amino acids to burn as fuel? Well, here are the 3 criteria that the body needs to decide which course to take of the amino acids. So the all or none rule means we need all amino acids present in order to build proteins. So if you're missing some essential amino acids, it's impossible to build a protein. So in that case, whenever amino acids are missing, amino acids will be used for fuel or energy. How about your caloric intake? Proteins used as a fuel if there's insufficient carbs or fat. So basically, typically we rely on carbohydrates and fat for fuel, and our amino acids are used to make protein. But if our diet is deficient in carbohydrates and fat, and there's nowhere to take energy from, well then our body must rely on our amino acids in order to produce ATP. There's also hormonal control. Certain hormones, like the growth hormone or sex hormones, like testosterone, for example, are anabolic, meaning building. So they accelerate protein synthesis and growth. So when these hormones are present, then amino acids will be used to synthesize proteins, not burn fuel. And also, our adrenal glucocorticoids, might recall these from our chapter on the endocrine system, chapter 16. These are hormones such as cortisol, for example, are released during stress. They promote protein breakdown. So that's kind of the opposite of normally what we would do. We use amino acids to build proteins. So in the case with these hormones, proteins break down into amino acids and use amino acids as fuel. So these are the 3 reasons why we might use our amino acids to burn as fuel instead of synthesize to proteins. So our body has to strike a nitrogen balance with our proteins, because recall from ANP1 that one of the base components of proteins is nitrogen in the amino group. But we have to strike this nitrogen balance, and what that means is the rate of protein synthesis equals the rate of its breakdown. So just as a normal, healthy, full-grown individual, we're under nitrogen balance. But we have positive nitrogen balance when our synthesis exceeds the breakdown. So when do we want to build structure faster than breaking it down? Well, children, because they're growing. So we need more building than breaking down. pregnant women because of the extra demands on the body and the fetus. Tissue repair, now we need to synthesize versus breaking down or injury or illness for the same reasons. Negative nitrogen balance would be when the breakdown exceeds the synthesis. So when do we want to break down structure versus building it, leaning that way? Well, this is typically not a good thing, as you can read here. Stress and burns and infection, injury, poor dietary conditions, starvation. Our body is going to be breaking down our structure, especially starvation, because it needs energy from somewhere. So this way we're actually losing structure at a higher rate than we're building it. So the dietary requirement for proteins is or fluctuates depending on many factors that you can read here, but just the rule of thumb is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, right? Not per pound, right? Per kilogram, there's 2.2 pounds in a kilogram. So now we can finish off table 24.1, but we're looking at proteins, that macronutrient. The food sources that we went through, where complete proteins come from, mainly animal products, and incomplete proteins. The recommended daily allowance, which we can see is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Excess proteins can lead to obesity, as with any excess macronutrient. Enhanced calcium excretion, which can lead to bone loss, is another result of excess protein intake. And at the other extreme, deficits, well, profound weight loss, just the opposite, of course, tissue wasting, limited growth, anemia, so during pregnancy, miscarriage, or premature birth. So some serious things with protein deficits, and so we try to maintain that recommended daily allowance as much as possible.